let's jump right into our interview tonight. We have on he's known as being a reggae historian, but he's so much more. He is a broadcaster, he is an actor, he's a photographer, he's an orator, he's one of these people behind the scenes of the music industry that really make it tick, and really a fan's fan. I'm a fan of music, so I'm really happy to have him on. Please welcome Roger.
How wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That when I said "ja," I said it in like a Jamaican voice.
That's fine.
Is it fine?
Yeah, it's you're calling the name of God.
Okay.
Jah Rastafari.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the reggae stuff first. A term I saw on your website, which I think might be my favorite phrase now, reggae resume.
Reggae resume.
The reggae resume.
Yeah.
The only thing synonymous I could think of is maybe a salsa CV. But you are the owner, the collector of the Reggae Archives.
See, guilty.
And I saw that you started collecting in 1973.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst to go from enjoying reggae music to I need to have 6 rooms in my house?
7 now. In 1973, I was making my living as a poet, and I was on the road from September to May every year in a different city each week, reading poetry for people who hate poetry. And I've been an actor all my life and a writer, and when I found something that excites me, I like to share it with people.
Yeah.
And joy is never diminished by sharing, said the Buddha. So I enjoy sharing things that have excited me in my life. And in 1973, Rolling Stone did an article that introduced reggae to America. I had never even heard the term before. And it was an article by an Australian gonzo journalist named Michael Thomas, who said, reggae music crawls into your bloodstream like some vampire amoeba from the psychic rapids of Upper Niger consciousness.
Love that.
I said, man, I don't know what that is.
You were sold.
But I got to find it. And I was living in Berkeley, and I went out that day and I found a used copy for $2 1/4 of Catch a Fire, Bob Marley and the Wailers' first American album. And my life changed forever. The next night in the little theater on the north side of Berkeley, I saw The Harder They Come. And when the chalice scene came on and everybody was smoking on the screen, everybody in the audience lit up, and you couldn't see the screen for all the smoke in the theater. And I bought the soundtrack to The Harder They Come on the way home. And my life changed forever from that moment. It's been going in a different direction, and it's been a 42-year obsession.
What is it? Because reggae, I got kind of pretty heavy into it about a year ago. The thing I liked about it is it's like hip hop R&B, where it's got like a groove. It's like very cool. But instead of the songs being about like, getting with women, or how much bling you have, what kind of car you drive, they're about civil rights. They're about spirituality. There are a fair amount of songs about lighting up and enjoying the island vibes.
Well, Jah is joy, so there's nothing wrong with being joyful. But Bob Marley said, dance to Jah music. Dance, jollify yourself, but do it consciously. Dance to music which raises your vibration. And the secret of reggae is that it is the beat of the healthy human heart at rest. Boom, 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 boom. And Keith Richards came to my archives a few years ago to make a film, and we were talking about this, and he says, well, the human heartbeat is 72 beats a minute, but the Rastafarians, they're clever. They play it at 71 beats a minute. I don't know whether he sat there with a stopwatch or not, but it is the heartbeat, and it is music that is positive and constructive. It speaks of unity, of love, of peace, of worshiping the Almighty Spirit that animates everything. And it teaches you how to live a better life.
Reggae is kind of a catch-all term for Jamaican music.
Yeah, it's like rock and roll.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's ska,
right,
which went through 1966.
That was the first Jamaican music.
It was a deliberate invention. When Jamaica became independent in 1962, the people in the new government got some of the key musicians together and said, we don't want to just be playing Trinidadian calypso here anymore. We want our own music. And a group called the Scatolites are considered the inventors of the ska beat. Ska, ska, ska,
It's
ska.
a little faster.
The tempo changes, but the basic rhythm pattern is always the heartbeat in all the different styles of music. 1966, the music slowed down. It became rock steady. Ba-boom-boom, ba-boom-boom, ba-boom-boom. And 2 years later was the birth of reggae music. That led to dub, to erasing most of the vocals from the instrumental track, which allowed their toasters or rappers to rap over them. And that became a style of music that began to be recorded around 1970 with King Tubby and U-Roy and Big Youth and Dennis Al Capone and a lot of the early rappers who first made rap records to sell to the public, not just toasting at dances. And that, you know, drum and bass, dubstep, I mean, there's 100 different musics that can trace their history directly to the slums of Western Jamaica, because it's not just a Jamaican music. It's not even a Kingstonian music. It is the music of the Western Kingston slums, where all these world-class artists emerged from out of the direst poverty. They beat it through their art.
I heard that it was almost these producers, because people didn't have record players and stuff, it was almost like a scam where people would come and make these records in the studio and they wouldn't even get a copy of them, or they wouldn't perform live. Is that accurate?
Well, not quite how it was. The artists rarely made any decent money. A song could sell 20 or 30,000 copies if it was a big hit, and they might get 20 pounds for it, you know, 30 bucks. And lucky to get a copy of their own record. That has changed a little bit in recent years, not that much. The rip-offs that were seen in the film The Harder They Come are still going on to this day. The music business in Jamaica right now is pretty corrupted. It's run by drug lords who finance their own artists and bribe the artists' records onto one of the 20 radio stations in Jamaica now. So it's a cutthroat business. As the returns diminished, the danger increased.
It's kind of like reggae, because it's so important, it has the spiritual aspect. It's kind of like reggae is the natural resource. Like music is what they can export, that they're able to pull it, because you know it's an impoverished area.
Yeah.
It's what do you owe that to? These like dire conditions leading to...
Because the IMF and the World Bank have basically destroyed the economy of the country. There's a remarkable documentary film that was called Life and Debt, that showed exactly how the IMF went in and forced so many things on Jamaica that the local economy was bankrupt, and they were forced to buy even more things from abroad. And they are so in debt that they'll probably never find a way out of it. So they're permanently indebted. It's a new form of slavery by the Western countries. The capitalist shitstem, as Peter Tosh called it.
Speaking of Peter Tosh, at a certain point of you being into reggae, you like became the guy, and you got to meet all of these people.
Well, it was through something that happened in LA in 1978. There was a record store down in the Crenshaw Shopping Center that opened a branch on the corner of La Brea and Hollywood, just across from the Four Silver Women, called Barton's Records. And they were importing records from their native Jamaica. And I was in there one afternoon looking for singles, and I met a fellow named Josh Harris who had a ska band called the Untouchables, and he told me about someone he had met the week before in the store named Hank Holmes, and he said this guy was incredible. He has over 8,000 Jamaican records, and he's never left LA in his life, and every Friday night he sells singles in his dining room. So I called him, and I told him that I'd been to Jamaica a couple of years earlier. I had my pocket picked in Bob Marley's record store by one of the biggest stars of reggae at the time. And he was fascinated and invited me over right away, and we became good friends. And I figured with his collection and my radio and acting background, my first broadcasts were in New York in 1961. My first guest was Olatunji, the Nigerian drummer, Drums of Passion. That we could do a great show, and we really wanted to get on KPFK because that was the left-wing bastion. That was emotionally where we thought we belonged, and we did 3 audition shows there for them, and they called us in, and we thought we were going to get the show finally after a year of knocking on every door in town, and they said, well, we can't in good conscience put you on KPFK playing black music because you're white. So in desperation, we went to this little tiny 105-watt radio station over in Santa Monica that was in a junior high school classroom, but had great plans to grow. And that was KCRW. And that's where I started on October 7th, 1979. Hank Holmes and I did the first 2-hour broadcast of the Reggae Beat. And when they do these annual fund drives begging for money. And they gave us an extra hour to pitch for funds on Sunday morning. And in 3 hours, we made what the previous 10-day fund drive had made. So our time was doubled to 4 hours a week, and it was commercial free, of course. And we were on different times, mainly on Sunday afternoons, like noon to 4 or 1 to 5. And it was like a public graduate course in reggae music for the whole city of Los Angeles. The LA Times said it was the most popular non-commercial radio show in LA. We made tens of thousands of dollars every year for the station. And because it was on a Sunday afternoon, the artists who would come up from Jamaica and play in town on Saturday night, or who were going to play on Sunday night, would all come to the show on Sunday afternoons. And Hank had such an extraordinary collection that he would bring in piles of singles by these guys, many of which the artists never knew existed before. Their songs had been ripped off by the producers and sold to people in England, and they never told the artists because they were afraid the artists would ask for money. So, and we would get them to perform live in the studio. Our first guest was Bob Marley. We got to go on the road for 2 weeks with him, and the happiest guy on the tour with us was the bus driver, because at the end of each evening he got to sweep up all the roaches. Sometimes he said he'd go home with half a pound. A Jamaican gets down to that, he just flicks it away. It's not worth saving. And I got to know Bob pretty well at that point. And in 1980, a Trinidadian drummer and filmmaker named Chili Charles approached me, and we started a reggae television show called LA Reggae, a cable show done from the heart for free, and that lasted 23 years. And in 1982, a woman named C.C. Smith began answering the telephones in the station, because we were getting so many calls every Sunday. And one Sunday she said, why don't we start a newsletter of some kind? And I told our audience, send us a letter with your address, and whatever we decide to do, we'll send you a free copy. And the following Sunday, we had 300 letters in the box. And Cece came running in, and she says, what should I do? Should I start a magazine? And I said, yeah, Cece, start a magazine. And that ended up, it started as the playlist to the radio show. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and it got glossy. And every year in May, I would do an annual Bob Marley edition, based on all the recent scholarship and the new interviews that had surfaced and photographs people have shared. And this magazine lasted for 27 years. In 2009, most of our advertisers were out of business, the little record labels. And so we finally closed, but I edited 27 annuals. And in 1984, I was asked to found the inaugural Reggae Grammy Committee. And I was chairman of that for 27 years. And that same year, I was invited to the American Film Festival, National Video Festival at the American Film Institute when it was up on Western. And they said, we want you to show your bootlegs. I said, really? They said, yeah, we want to show how collectors preserve the past, the pieces that the mainstream has no interest in. And at that point, I had put together about maybe 300 hours of unreleased reggae footage, including stuff from our own show. And I did an evening of bootlegs, and I got a great review in Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, and I started getting requests from around the state to come and do the same thing. And so for the past 31 years, I've been doing a show called The Life of Bob Marley, which is 2 hours of unreleased footage, and in between the clips, I tell Bob Marley's life story with a constant stream of photographs, many of which I took behind me. And on February 6th coming up, which will be Bob Marley's 71st birthday, there's a wonderful yoga center that opened recently on Highland, just south of Sunset Boulevard on the corner of DeLongpre and Highland, called Wanderlust. And they're going to present an all-day Marley festival, and I'm going to do my Life of Bob Marley show there on February 6th. So it has taken me literally all over the world, from the bottom of the Grand Canyon, where the Havasupai Indians believe that Bob Marley is the reincarnation of Chief Crazy Horse returned to earth as a black man to lead the red man forward to his freedom again, to the outback of Australia with the Aboriginals who practically worship Bob Marley as a god there. And all over Europe, we played in Poland a couple of years ago in a castle built in the year 1200 where Napoleon had lived in the early 1800s with his Polish mistress. And the Reggae Festival was held in the ruins of a 19th century Prussian cavalry barn. There's no place on earth that is untouched by the music of Bob Marley. It's just truly extraordinary.
Why do you think Bob Marley is far and above the most popular reggae artist? I couldn't second maybe Jimmy Clifford.
He had everything. Bob Marley had everything. He had the looks. He was half white. There are so many different kinds of photographs of him. Sometimes he looks like Cheops. Sometimes he looks like an Aztec. Another time he looks like a Cherokee Indian. Sometimes with that little leprechaun nose from his grandfather. He looks like an Irishman. He's all things to all people. He was incredibly handsome. He had a fantastic voice. He had an inspired gift of melody and of poetry. He was able to synthesize the most complex situations and reduce them to a couplet in talking about the horrors of capitalism. He said, "Good God, this illiteracy is just machine to make money. Keep people ignorant, keep people uneducated. You can pay them 17 cents an hour in Indonesia to make Nike sneakers." So he knew what he was talking about. And he was deeply devoted to the cause of black people and black liberation. There's no doubt about that. He identified as black. There's an alternate version I have in the archives of One Drop, one of the last songs he recorded, where he's singing, "I'm black, I'm black, I'm black, I'm black, I'm black, I'm black, I'm black." So there's no doubt in anybody's mind where he was coming from. But he also said, God does not know color. One of his most eloquent songs, one of his most lasting songs for sure, will be the words that Haile Selassie spoke at the United Nations on October 4th, 1963, known as the War Speech. Until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, everywhere is war. And I was the opening act for 2 months in 2013 for the Wailers Band. And they revived the album that Bob was promoting when I was on the road with him for 2 weeks in 1979, his next to the last album, Survival. And there are two phenomenally deep albums about resistance and revolution in his career. His first solo album in 1974, Natty Dread, with lines like, "I feel like bombing a church now that I know the preacher is lying. Who's going to stay at home when the freedom fighters are fighting?" Then he got shot. And in 1979, he made the greatest album of his life, the one that summed up his mature philosophy, and that was Survival. And at that point, he realized that violence is not the answer. An eye for an eye is not the answer. And that in order to change the world, we must first change ourselves, and that change will radiate outwards. But the key to it is one love. And that became his gift to the world, the one love philosophy. And when the millennium came, the BBC did a 24-hour round-the-globe coverage as each time zone entered the 21st century. And in each of those 24 countries, the segment opened with the local people singing One Love as the one song that everyone on earth could relate to. So Bob became a universal figure. He is, without question, the most important musical artist of the 20th century. That's not just my opinion, but the New York Times said that he was the most influential musician of the second half of the 20th century. The first half was Louis Armstrong. They were both daily herb smokers. And at the millennium, Time magazine chose Exodus, his 1967 album, as the album of the 20th century. But one of the great things that happened at that time was when the New York Times decided to build a time capsule, and they wanted to choose one work of musical art for people 1,000 years from now, if there's anybody left, at the next millennium, to see the finest moments of the 20th century musically. And what they chose to put in there was the video of Bob Marley live at the Rainbow Theatre in London in 1977. And in 1996, the New York Times Sunday magazine celebrated its 100th anniversary of publication. And they asked each of their critics to choose one work of art in their field that they felt would last 100 years into the future. And John Pirellis, the eloquent pop critic for the New York Times, chose Burnin', the last album by Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh, and Bob Marley working as the Wailers in 1973. And John Pirellis wrote, Bob Marley became the voice of third world pain and resistance, the sufferer in the concrete jungle who would not be denied forever. Outsiders everywhere heard his voice as their own. If he could make himself heard, so could they without compromise. In 2096, when the former third world has overrun and colonized the former superpowers, Bob Marley will be commemorated as a saint.
Yeah. So that's, I never had thought about his multi ethnic kind of because there's much more people in the third world than there are in the first world, but he was able to use these first world tools to get in there. Do you think that that is important besides music or trying to sell records or anything? Do you think that that kind of synthesis is a lesson we could take away from Bob Marley?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was a universal person, wasn't he? He was the universal man. He was the cocoa-colored man that we're all destined to become.
That's right.
And he tried to see beyond race. I think you make a good point, yeah. It's part of his magnetism to the whole world. Plus, he was a man of roots. We talk about rootical things in Jamaica, rootical actions, rootical feelings, being in touch with your roots. For Bob, that was Africa. He said we all have to go back to Africa, go forward to Africa, forward ever, backward never. And Bob used all the brand new tools of the studio and of communications. He had an extraordinary publicist who really is the guy who put him on the map. He was a Liverpool Irishman named Charlie Comer, big bulbous ex-alcoholic nose. He worked in Liverpool with Brian Epstein before Epstein found the Beatles. And Charlie Comer was in the helicopter going into Shea Stadium with the Beatles when they played there. And he became Bob Marley's publicist in the 70s after working for Mick Jagger and John Lennon in the 60s. And from the late 70s forward, he was Peter Tosh's publicist. I can tell you Peter Tosh story.
Okay.
In September of '79, Charlie called me from New York, and he says, Roger, Peter's in your town, and he's got no herb. Can you help him? And I said, well, Charlie, as a matter of fact, I've just come back from a friend's plantation in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and he had a whole bunch of 16-foot plants, and he gave me 2 of the tops, the colas, that are like 2 feet long and about as round as a grapefruit. And I said, I'll fix Peter up just fine. And he says, well, he's at the Sunset Marquee, and he gave me the room number. So my wife, Mary, put this beautiful wrapping paper all around this, put a red, gold, and green ribbon around it, tied it into a bow, and we go off to the Sunset Marquee. So we get to the hotel, and he's got a chain on the door. We knock on the door, and he opens it a crack, and he sees Mary and me standing there, and I've got this huge thing all wrapped up in my hand. And he says, oh, what at? And I said, well, it's a gift to you, Bush Doctor, from all the herbalists in California. So he lets go of the chain, grabs me, pulls me, and grabs Mary, pulls her, and slams the door, puts the chain on, all in about 5 seconds. And he rips a little of the paper off, and he sees what it is, and he takes the bow off and rips the paper. He looks at this thing, holding it in both his hands, breaks a piece off, and he smells it, looks down the barrel of it. Then he turns to me, and he says, Chaw, take a whole lot more than this to get my propeller spin. But he didn't give it back.
Hey, you get the propeller moving a little bit, you know, maybe some momentum. And then. So you've interviewed, you've met a lot of amazing musical artists and stuff.
Yeah, not just reggae.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you about when I was going through the list. Matt Groening, that seems pretty cool. Yeah. Little Richard.
Oh my God.
Tell me about Little Richard.
Oh my God, Little
Richard.
Richard.
My idol.
Greatest interview of my life, and I've interviewed 2,000 people. Greatest interview. I grew up, I'm 73, so I was 12 years of age when Alan Freed came to New York with rock and roll. And I used to go to his stage shows, saw Little Richard in 1958, and always loved him. And in 1980, I think it was 85, he came to KCRW, and I did an interview with him there that was filmed by the BBC and became 20 minutes of this hour-long documentary on his life. But he was irrepressible. I said, what do you think Mick Jagger learned from you? Because he toured with the Beatles and the Stones before either of them had ever made a record in Hamburg in '62. I said, what do you think Mick Jagger learned from you? And Richard goes, oh, how to walk. And he couldn't stop talking about Buddy Holly's schlong. He said he was at an Alan Freed show for 10 days in New York and hanging out in Buddy Holly's dressing room. He was huge, 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 huge. He said huge 13 times, and then he said, I loved Buddy.
Yeah, Little Richard seems like the kind of person who has an answer for everything, which
I
think that's a great quality.
I said, you're the only guy, I think, who claims the title of the king and the queen of rock and roll. And he says, I don't deny them no title. And he called me Alan Freed Roger. He said I sounded like him, I looked like him. And Alan Freed was my hero growing up. He's the man who coined the term rock and roll. His first, quote, rock and roll dance was in Cleveland in 1952, and it was a riot because the hall held 4,000 people and they sold 20,000 tickets. And they had to call out the police. And the next day there was a headline, Rock and Roll Riot Hits Cleveland. And rock and roll was born. And 2 years later he came to New York and revolutionized music. The 3 radio stations within 3 weeks of Freed's arrival in New York changed their entire formats to rock and roll in September of 1954. And I used to hang out at his radio station in the summertime in New York in Columbus Circle at WINS. I met him several times. I told him once I wanted to be Alan Freed when I grew up. And he laughed. And Tim Hauser from the Manhattan Transfer, the bald guy in the Transfer, had a radio show right before my Reggae Beat show on Sundays. And one Sunday as he was turning it over, he said, and now stay tuned for the Alan Freed of Reggae, Roger Steffens. And, yeah.
So that was, you did become Alan Freed.
In a way.
Yeah.
I mean, he made movies, he had a television show, radio show.
As close as
he never had a magazine.
Oh, yeah. So see, maybe there's some young, some like dubstep enthusiast now or something who wants to be the next Ross Roja.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Climb to even higher heights. We all build on what has come in the past.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about your journey, kind of, because besides the reggae, you do a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
And it seems like you kind of just follow your heart. I mean, I know a thought goes into it, but you kind of you hear what Jaw's saying,
Yeah.
and you kind of go into it. So, did you start in radio? Like, what got you to the point where you were in Berkeley to get that Wailers album?
Interesting. Well, I started acting when I was 5. My mother in New York was very into theater, Broadway, and we went to a lot of shows, and she was always mounting little local theatricals and dressing us up in crepe paper costumes, and I was always Prince Charming and stuff like that. And then I did a lot of acting in high school, but oratory too. I had an old Irish Christian brother named Brother Michael Bradley at Bergen Catholic High School in Oradell, New Jersey, just over the bridge. And he heard something in me when I was a sophomore yelling in the playground. And he said, "I want you for my public speaking club." I said, "I didn't know he had one. It was a new school." He says, "We do now, you're it." And he took me under his wing for 3 years. And I lost every single oratory contest I entered until I was a senior. And I was the New Jersey State Oratory Champion and won a scholarship to Rutgers and another one to Iona. Rutgers for oratory, Iona for acting. And acted through college, went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, went for a while to Carnegie Tech, and Carnegie Mellon now in Pittsburgh, both of them very old acting schools. And started acting when I was 23 professionally, joined the resident company of the Milwaukee Repertory Theater as an apprentice, made $41.52 a week, which I lived on. And on Valentine's Day 1966, I was invited to a black high school in Milwaukee to read poetry at 8:30 in the morning. And I said, "They'll kill me." And the teacher said, "No, they'll love it. Do whatever you want." And at that point, I'd been reading for many years in coffee houses, first in New York and then in Milwaukee. And I was reading beatnik poets, Ferlinghetti, Corso, and a lot of local Milwaukee madmen. And I went there at 8:30 and read a bunch of poems, and these kids really dug it. And the teacher said, "We're studying Macbeth. Can you do something from that?" I said, "Well, I know the dagger speech, but you know, I'm thinking to myself, if I just go out and start doing Shakespeare, they're not going to get into that." So there was a fellow named Lord Buckley. Are you familiar with him?
Yes. Yeah.
Lord Buckley translated everything into the vernacular of the hip. Friends, Romans, countrymen became hipsters, flipsters, and finger-poppin' daddies. Knock me your lobes. And Jesus was the Naz. The Naz hip the kitty with the bent wing, made it straight, yeah. So I did a kind of Lord Buckley-esque telling of the main plot of Macbeth and then segued into the dagger speech. And I got a standing ovation at the end of the class. And she asked me to stay for the next class, and by the third class I was in the gym with 400 students. And I did 5 assemblies that day. And the next week, the Milwaukee Journal did a story about it on the front page of their art section. "Young actor is hip on Macbeth, makes teens dig Shakespeare." And I started getting requests from all over the state. And so I began doing that for a living. And then I got drafted in '67. I believe the recruiter who said you should join up for an extra year because you're an actor and we'll put you in radio and TV and we don't have any stations in Vietnam. What he didn't say was yet. So I enlisted for an extra year when I got drafted at 25 in 1967. And they sent me to stenography school after basic training. I was furious. "You're ours now. We can do anything we damn well please with you." But it happened to be at the same fort where the Defense Radio and TV School was, and I got transferred into what I was supposed to do. And my first assignment was to Ethiopia, to Eritrea, considering my life in reggae and the Ethiopian emperor's influence on the Jamaicans. That was ironic. But 3 days before the end of class, everybody had their orders canceled, and we were shipped off en masse to the PSYOP school, psychological operations, propaganda warfare. The JFK Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And they gave us 3 weeks indoctrination into PSYOPs, and they said, you can't fail this class. Whatever you do, you're going to numb. And we were trained by Nazi films. Leni Riefenstahl's 4-hour uncut version of Triumph of the Will, you know, the Nazi Nuremberg rally, the 4-hour version, uncut, was our first class. 3 weeks later, the last class was the same 4-hour film repeated. Now go off to Vietnam and emulate this. And we were to go to join frontline combat units carrying 80-pound loudspeaker backpacks broadcasting pre-recorded cassette surrender messages to the Viet Cong. I have you surrounded. We have you surrounded. Yeah, and when I got to Saigon, they looked at my IQ and my typing speed and said, the colonel's typist is going home next week. Would you like to stay in that air-conditioned hotel across the street with the hot and cold running water and be the colonel's typist? Yeah. And I was there for 3 months when the Tet Offensive broke out. And there were 52 families living in these huge sewer pipes in front of my barrack hotel. And the Vietnamese government was telling everybody that there were no refugees, nothing to worry about. And these people were dying in the street. So I wrote to a town in the Midwest where I had spoken, read poetry at all the schools 2 or 3 times in Racine, Wisconsin. And to make a long story short, I ended up raising over 100 tons of food and clothing. The first shipment came in on 2 5-ton trucks with these little packages all addressed to me spilling out. And so I extended until I could get an early out. So I was in Vietnam for 26 months. Altogether, I was in service 31. And I was awarded a Bronze Star and a Vietnamese Civic Action Medal and that stuff. And I never fired a shot, and I survived the Tet Offensive in Saigon and the May Offensive. They burned my whole block to the ground. They dropped 3 rockets on us. And I wrote about it. I wrote about it constantly to people in the States, and came back in '70 and lectured against the war for a year, back and forth across the country. And then I decided I just didn't want to live under Nixon and Kissinger anymore. They're still bombing Hanoi, and they're just lying murderers. And I moved to Marrakesh. I had met my first wife on the island of the Coconut Monk in Vietnam, an island of 6,000 pacifists in the middle of the Mekong River, led by a 4.5-foot tall hunchback monk who hadn't lain down in 20 years. The north bank of the river controlled by the Americans, the south bank by the communists. They'd fire rockets and mortars over the island and never touch the island. And there were 6,000 people from both armies, the north and south, and Taoists, all living there in peace and serenity. And I met my first wife there, who was a war correspondent. And we came back to the States, and then we moved to Marrakesh in '71, spent most of the year there, and came back. You know, a year in the Medina teaches you that you're an American. And I was so into music for the previous 20 years, and I was really looking for something to reignite my interest, because by the early '70s, the lawyers and the accountants had bought all the independent labels, and it was disco dreck and just crap. And the commitment of the '60s music was missing, and those great harmonies of the '50s doo-wop, which I loved so much. And then all of a sudden, I read that article in Rolling Stone, and there it was. It was the ethereal harmonies in groups like the Mighty Diamonds and Burning Spear and Culture and the Wailers, mixed with the folk music and Dylan-esque commitment to political change and social awareness. And it was all there in one package. Plus it talked about how great marijuana was and how cool it was to be worshiping God while you're sucking a chalice. And so what's not to like? And everybody I came in contact with after 1973, I always talked about reggae to them. And then, of course, everything else happened after that. So that was the progression. I had been a Goldwater conservative. My first presidential vote, Jesus, was in 1964 when I was 22 for Barry Goldwater. I worked for William Buckley in New York for a while too. Ah, what fools these mortals be. So the Vietnam War woke me up once and for all, and I've never looked back.
Wow.
That's a long way around. I hope it answers your question.
No, it's you know, because it's I said at the top of the program, you know, the present is just the past and what you hope the future is going to be.
Yeah.
But you know, this moment that we're in right now, it's all dictated to us by everything else that's happened. And you know, that lady making the Blue Scratch Perry movie.
Yeah.
I won tickets to that.
Oh,
free.
you did?
Yeah.
That's how you heard about it?
Yeah. I didn't even, I don't think it was well
promoted. Who'd you win the tickets from?
Do LA, like some newsletter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it comes out on Wednesdays.
Oh, good.
So I sent in my email. I go through it, like the stuff I'd want to see. Like, oh, I'd go to that. And they sent it to me, and then we met. So it's all just about like serendipity. I think we're almost out of time. There's two things I wanted to ask you about. Okay, so you talked about Selassie and Ethiopia. So according to the Rastafarians, Selassie is literally the Lord on earth? That's what they literally believe?
There are various beliefs. Some think he's God Almighty incarnate in this body. Others think he's Jesus, but Jesus, because Jesus is a fiction from King James and all of those people. The real Jesus was Jesus. I'll give you the nutshell. Bible says that when Christ returns to the earth, it will no longer be as a lamb to the slaughter, but in his kingly character as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. 1912, street preachers in Kingston started prophesying the imminent return of a black king in Africa as a signal that the day of deliverance or repatriation is near. 1930, the prophecy is fulfilled when a nobleman named Ras Tafari, which means head creator, who is a direct lineage from King Solomon, 222nd king, I think, marries the empress, becomes Emperor Haile Selassie, which means power of the Trinity, and takes the title King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. Everybody in Jamaica says, this is he of whom we've heard. This is God returned.
We've heard about this. This is the guy. He's the only
18 years they've been preaching this.
Head of state.
Yeah.
So what do you believe? Do you think it was just good timing? Or do you think he's really, he had some of that magic?
I think we are all God. We are all manifestations of the one true and living God. And leave it at that.
Okay. Last question. I see there's usually a timer up there. I'm having to look on the... 1 minute. Okay, great. Last question. Irie, that's the Jamaican word for happiness.
It comes from higher heights, Irie-ites.
What gives you Irie?
Oh, sharing things with people, seeing smiles on people's faces, letting the world know what I've learned in this totally unpredictable life that I've had, to share joy, to make things better in whatever way I can. That's Irie to me. Well, plus a big spliff.
Well, thank you for sharing everything with us.
Boy, that was fast. What? That's an hour?
Yeah.
Holy cow. It's been a joy.
Minutes.
Thank you.
Great. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Until next week, this is Adam Papagan, reminding you that there's a place you can go, and it's your mind. Good night.
One love.
One love.